I was slapped across the face by my husband for stealing a fake necklace that I did not take. The force of his hand sent me stumbling back against the cold marble pillar of the ballroom, and the taste of iron instantly filled my mouth. The music stopped abruptly, and the chatter of 200 wealthy guests in the Harrington mansion died down to a suffocating silence. I kept my head down, letting my hair cover my burning cheek. Not because I was afraid, but because I checked the antique clock on the wall and realized I still had 2 hours left. My personal guard, Sebastian, would not arrive until midnight to extract me from this hell, if I fought back now. The spies from the rebel faction watching this house would know I was still capable of combat. I had to look weak. I had to look like the pathetic, orphan charity case that Liam Harrington had married for good publicity 3 years ago. Liam stood over me, adjusting his expensive Italian cuffs, his face twisted in a sneer that I once mistook for a smile. He did not look like a husband. He looked like a CEO disciplining a disobedient employee. The crowd whispered like a swarm of bees, their eyes darting between me and Tiffany Vance, the senator's daughter, who was sobbing fake tears into a silk handkerchief. Eleanor Harrington, my mother-in-law, marched forward with the stride of a general on a battlefield. She threw a black velvet bag at my feet. It hit the floor with a dull thud. She pointed a manicured finger at my nose, her diamond rings flashing under the chandelier light. She announced to the room that they found the necklace in my jewelry box during a random search by the house security. It was a lie so clumsy that a child could see through it. But nobody here cared about the truth. They only cared about the show. Eleanor hissed that I was nothing but a gutter rat who could not control her greedy instincts. She said I should be grateful that the Harringtons took me in when I was starving on the streets of New York. Every word she spoke was calculated to strip away my dignity layer by layer. She did not just want to accuse me. She wanted to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I could never show my face in this city again. Liam grabbed my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes were cold, devoid of any affection that might have existed in the past 3 years. He told me that he was disappointed, but not surprised. He said that a woman of my background could never truly understand the value of honesty or loyalty. Tiffany clung to his arm, looking at me with a triumphant smirk hidden behind her tears. She whispered to Liam that he should not be too harsh, that perhaps I stole it because I was insecure about my poverty. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Liam nodded, agreeing with her poisonous sympathy. He turned to the security team standing in the shadows and ordered them to bring the documents. I knew what was coming. They had been preparing this for months. They did not want to call the police because a scandal would hurt the company's stock price. They wanted a quiet, efficient disposal. A lawyer stepped forward, placing a thick stack of papers on the small table beside me. It was a divorce settlement, already drafted, stamped, and waiting for my signature. The terms were brutal and simple. I would admit to the theft in a private confession. I would sign away all rights to spousal support, and I would leave the premises immediately with nothing but the clothes on my back. In exchange, they would not press charges and send me to prison for grand larceny. It was blackmail, wrapped in a legal bow. Liam uncapped a fountain pen and held it out to me. He told me that this was his final act of mercy. He said I had 1 minute to sign, or he would have the security team drag me to the nearest police station. I looked at the pen, then at the clock. 1 hour and 45 minutes remaining. The timing was tight, but I could make it work. I took the pen, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of suppressing the urge to break his fingers. I signed my name, Grace Sterling, on the dotted line. The scratch of the nib on paper sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I had just signed away my marriage, my home, and my name. But in reality, I had just signed my own release warrant. As soon as the ink was dry, Eleanor snatched the papers away as if they were made of gold. She checked the signature twice, a cruel smile spreading across her face. She signaled to the head of security, a brute named Marcus who had always enjoyed pushing me around. Eleanor ordered him to escort me off the property immediately. She told the guests to resume the party, claiming that the trash had been taken out. Marcus grabbed my arm with a grip that was meant to bruise. He did not let me pack a bag. He did not let me put on a coat. He dragged me through the grand hallway, past the portraits of Liam's ancestors who seemed to look down on me with disdain. The guests parted like the Red Sea, some laughing, some recording with their phones to post on social media. I heard Tiffany laugh loudly, asking Liam if he wanted to dance. The heavy oak doors were thrown open, and the bitter winter wind of New York slammed into me. Marcus shoved me forward, and I stumbled down the stone steps, landing hard on the icy pavement of the driveway. The heavy doors slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final judgment. I was left alone in the freezing darkness, shivering in a thin evening gown. The snow was falling heavily, covering my bare arms in seconds. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my dress. I did not cry. I did not look back at the warm, glowing windows of the mansion where my husband was celebrating my departure. Instead, I walked to the edge of the estate gates, counting the seconds in my head. The spies who had been monitoring the house for the last 3 years would see a broken woman leaving in disgrace. They would report to their superiors that the threat was neutralized, that I was no longer under the protection of the powerful Harrington family. They would leave, and they did. I saw 2 black sedans parked down the street start their engines and drive away, disappearing into the night. They thought the game was over. They were wrong. The game had just begun. I stood there for exactly 10 minutes until the taillights of the spy cars faded completely. Then, a pair of headlights cut through the snowstorm. A long, sleek Rolls-Royce Phantom with diplomatic flags on the hood pulled up silently to the curb. It was not a car you could buy with money. It was a fortress on wheels. The rear door opened, and a tall man in a dark trench coat stepped out. He held a large black umbrella, shielding me from the snow instantly. It was Sebastian. He did not look at my bruised cheek or my torn dress with pity. He looked at them with a cold, simmering rage. He bowed low, a gesture of absolute respect that no one in the Harrington house had ever shown me. He spoke in our native tongue, his voice steady and deep. He told me that the plane was ready and the king was waiting. He said, "Welcome back, Your Highness." I stepped into the warmth of the car, leaving Grace Sterling behind on the frozen pavement. The girl who swept floors was dead. The princess had returned. The interior of the Rolls-Royce Phantom was a sanctuary of silence and warmth, a stark contrast to the biting wind that had just frozen my tears on my cheeks. I sank into the hand-stitched leather seat, the heated massage function instantly relaxing the muscles that had been tense for 3 long years. Sebastian sat opposite me, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the perimeter through the tinted, bulletproof windows. He opened a compartment and retrieved a crystal glass and a bottle of vintage water sourced from the glaciers of Valoria. He poured it with a steady hand, not spilling a single drop despite the car moving over a pothole. He handed me the glass, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the red handprint fading on my left cheek. I took a sip, the cool liquid washing away the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. I did not speak immediately. I simply breathed, inhaling the scent of expensive leather and absolute safety. The trembling in my hands stopped. The girl who scrubbed floors and apologized for existing was gone. In her place sat Genevieve, the rightful heir to a throne that controlled more gold reserves than the entire Federal Reserve of New York. I reached up and pulled the cheap hair tie from my messy bun, letting my hair cascade down my shoulders in soft waves. I wiped the smudge of dirt from my forehead with a hot towel Sebastian provided. I looked at the reflection in the darkened window. The fear was gone from my eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. I asked Sebastian for the status report. He tapped his tablet, projecting a holographic display onto the partition glass. He informed me that the coup in our homeland had been crushed 3 hours ago. My father, the Grand Duke, had reinstated the royal guard and arrested the traitorous generals. The assets that had been frozen to protect me were now fully unlocked. The accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and the federal bank were active. I watched the numbers scroll across the screen, figures so large they looked like phone numbers. Sebastian told me that my father wanted to speak with me, but I raised my hand. Not yet. I had unfinished business in this city. I looked at the dossier on the screen, the file labeled Harrington Tech. It was time to audit the books of the man who had just thrown me away like garbage. The car glided through the streets of Manhattan, ignoring the traffic lights as the diplomatic plates granted us immunity. We arrived at the private underground entrance of the Pierre Hotel, where the royal penthouse had been maintained empty for me for 3 years, waiting for this very night. The staff was lined up by the elevator, heads bowed low. They did not see a rejected wife in a torn dress. They saw royalty. The manager, a discreet Swiss man named Mr. Dubois, stepped forward with a velvet robe. He apologized for the weather as if he could control the snow. I walked past them, my head held high, the torn hem of my dress trailing on the marble floor like a train. The elevator whisked us up to the 42nd floor. The doors opened to a panoramic view of Central Park covered in white. It was beautiful, but cold, just like the people I had left behind. I went straight to the master suite, stripping off the cheap polyester dress that Eleanor had forced me to wear. I threw it into the fireplace. I watched the synthetic fabric melt and blacken, the flames consuming the last remnant of gray sterling. I stepped into the shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red, washing away the scent of that house, the scent of his cologne, the scent of my own humiliation. Meanwhile, back at the Harrington estate, the party was reaching its peak of vulgarity. Liam Harrington stood in the center of the room, a glass of scotch in one hand and Tiffany Vance on his arm. He was laughing at a joke made by a board member, feeling lighter than he had in years. He told himself that he had made the right choice. Grace was a liability, a dead weight that held him back from the social elite. Now, with Tiffany, the daughter of a senator, by his side, the doors to Washington would open wide. Eleanor was holding court near the buffet, recounting the story of the theft to anyone who would listen. She embellished the details, claiming I had begged on my knees and tried to steal silverware too. The guests chuckled, shaking their heads at the audacity of the poor. They drank champagne paid for by the profits of the company I had secretly saved from bankruptcy twice. They ate caviar imported through trade deals I had facilitated anonymously. They had no idea that the foundation of their luxury was the woman they had just cast out into the snow. Liam raised his toast, announcing a new era for Harrington Tech, predicting record profits for the next quarter. The universe, however, has a wicked sense of humor. And tonight, I was the one writing the punchline. As Liam brought the glass to his lips, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again, long and persistent. It was the emergency line, the one reserved for catastrophic failures. He frowned, excusing himself from Tiffany's grasp. He walked to a quiet corner and answered. It was his chief financial officer, a man who usually had nerves of steel. Tonight. The man was stuttering. He told Liam that there was a problem with the liquidity fund. Liam scoffed, telling him to fix it and not bother him during the party. The CFO's voice rose to a panic. He explained that it was not a glitch. The primary investor, a shadowy European consortium known as the Valoria Trust, had just pulled their entire capital. $500 million. Gone. In a second. The line of credit was frozen. The bank was already calling to demand collateral. Liam felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the phone tighter, asking if it was a mistake. The CFO said the withdrawal notification came with a note, a single line referencing a breach of the morality clause in the contract. Liam stood frozen in the corner, the festive music sounding distorted and distant. He looked across the room at his mother, who was laughing with her head thrown back. He looked at Tiffany, who was flirting with a young heir. He tried to process the information. The Valoria Trust had been their silent backer for 3 years, the very years he had been married to Grace. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was impossible. Grace was a nobody. This had to be a coincidence, a market fluctuation, a misunderstanding. He dialed the number of his contact at the trust, a man he had never met in person but who had always approved his requests. The line rang once, then clicked. A recorded voice spoke in a crisp, British accent. It stated that the number was no longer in service for Harrington Tech authorized personnel. Access denied. Liam felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He loosened his tie, feeling the room spinning. He needed to find a solution before the market opened tomorrow morning. If the news leaked that they had lost their main backer, the stock would plummet to zero. He chugged the scotch, the burning liquid doing nothing to calm the rising terror in his gut. Back in the penthouse, I stepped out of the dressing room. I was no longer wearing rags. I was dressed in a structured midnight blue suit from Chanel, wearing the sapphire earrings that belonged to my grandmother. Sebastian stood by the window, holding a secure satellite phone. He told me that the first phase was complete. The capital withdrawal had been executed at exactly 10:15 post-meridian. I walked over to the desk where a bank of monitors displayed the financial vitals of Harrington Tech. The graph was a flat line, waiting for the drop. I picked up a tablet and opened the live feed from the security cameras I had hacked into at the Harrington mansion. I saw Liam in the corner, pale and sweating. I zoomed in on his face. It was the look of a man who realized he was standing on a trapdoor. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was not enough. Money was just the beginning. I wanted to take his pride. I wanted to take his reputation. I wanted to take the very thing he sacrificed me for his social standing. I turned to Sebastian and gave the next order. I told him to leak the video of the theft to the media, but not the version Eleanor wanted. I wanted the unedited version, the one that showed the truth. Sebastian nodded, his fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. He accessed the cloud server of the Harrington security system. Eleanor thought she was smart by deleting the footage that showed her planting the necklace, but she didn't know that the system had a mirror backup that sent everything to my private server. I watched the footage on the big screen. It showed Eleanor slipping the necklace into my jewelry box while I was in the shower. It showed her laughing with Tiffany afterwards. It was undeniable proof of a frame-up. I told Sebastian to send it to every major news outlet in New York, to the gossip blogs, to the board members of Harrington Tech, and to the ethics committee of the senator's office. I wanted Tiffany Vance to wake up famous tomorrow, but for all the wrong reasons. I wanted Eleanor to become the face of aristocratic cruelty, and I wanted Liam to be known as the coward who stood by and watched. I took a sip of red wine, the rich flavor settling on my tongue. The clock struck midnight. The Cinderella story was reversed. The carriage didn't turn into a pumpkin. The pumpkin turned into a tank. And I was driving it straight through their front door. At the mansion. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Phones started lighting up around the room. Guests were checking their notifications, whispering, glancing at Eleanor and then looking away quickly. The murmurs grew louder. Eleanor noticed the change. She stopped her story mid-sentence, sensing the eyes on her were no longer admiring. She grabbed the arm of a passing waiter and asked what was happening. The waiter looked at her with a mix of fear and disgust. Pulling his arm away, he muttered something about the news. Eleanor pulled out her phone. Her face went gray. The video was everywhere. It was trending on Twitter. The Harrington frame-up. Comments were flooding in by the thousands, calling for a boycott, calling for arrests. Tiffany screamed from across the room. She was looking at her own social media, where her pristine image was being shredded by the public. Liam rushed over, grabbing his mother's phone. He watched the video, the color draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room, searching for someone to blame. But there was no one, just the accusing stares of the people he tried so hard to impress. Then, the lights in the ballroom flickered and went out. The music died. Emergency lights bathed the room in a harsh, red glow. The heavy oak doors at the entrance banged open. Not by wind this time, but by force. A group of men in dark suits walked in. They were not police. They were federal agents from the Department of Labor and the IRS. The man in front held up a badge. He announced that they had received an anonymous tip regarding massive tax fraud and labor violations at Harrington Tech. Supported by digital evidence provided 5 minutes ago, he ordered everyone to stay where they were. He walked straight to Liam. He did not ask for a signature. He produced a pair of handcuffs. He told Liam Harrington that he was under investigation for corporate espionage and embezzlement. Liam stammered, saying it was a mistake, saying he had powerful friends. The agent ignored him, clicking the metal cuffs around his wrists. The sound was distinct, sharp, and final. Across the city, in the warm glow of the penthouse, I watched the live feed on my screen. I whispered softly to the image of my husband in handcuffs. I told him that this was just the interest. The principal debt was yet to be paid. The heavy metal doors of the NYPD precinct swung open, and Liam Harrington stepped out into a blinding storm of camera flashes. He shielded his eyes, not from the sun, but from the predatory glare of the media vultures waiting to pick his carcass clean. His lawyer, a man named Stone who cost $2,000 an hour, shoved a path through the crowd, shouting no comment to the microphones thrust into Liam's face. Questions rained down like hail, asking about the theft, the fraud, and the abuse of his wife. Liam kept his head down, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He was out on a $10 million bail, posted by leveraging the last unmortgaged property the family owned. The humiliation burned in his gut like acid. He was the golden boy of New York Tech, the man on the cover of Forbes. And now he was being treated like a common criminal because of a misunderstanding. He climbed into the waiting black SUV, the leather seat cold against his back. Stone sat beside him, tapping furiously on his tablet. He told Liam that the stock had dropped 40% in pre-market trading. The board had called an emergency meeting for 10 o'clock sharp. They were talking about a vote of no confidence. Liam slammed his fist against the armrest, cursing the incompetence of his public relations team. He grabbed his phone, dialing his chief financial officer for the 10th time. The man finally picked up, his voice trembling with exhaustion. Liam demanded to know who authorized the withdrawal of the Valoria Trust funds. He screamed that it was a breach of contract, that he would sue them into oblivion. The CFO hesitated, then dropped the bomb that silenced Liam's rage instantly. He explained that the contract had a specific clause. Page 104, Section 3. The moral turpitude clause. It stated that if the primary beneficiary engaged in conduct that brought public shame or disrepute, the lender had the right to demand immediate repayment of the full principal plus interest. The video of Eleanor framing Grace was the trigger. Liam felt the blood drain from his face. He had signed that contract 3 years ago without reading the fine print, too arrogant to believe he could ever fail. The CFO added one more detail. The trust had sold the debt. It had been purchased at dawn by a private holding company called Sterling Assets. The new owner was coming to the board meeting to execute a debt-for-equity swap. The SUV sped towards the Harrington Tower. Cutting through the morning traffic of Manhattan, Liam tried to process the information. Sterling Assets. The name sounded familiar, but he could not place it. He told himself that this was actually good news. A private investor meant a person, and people could be manipulated. He was Liam Harrington. He could charm anyone. He would walk into that meeting, explain that the video was a deepfake, blame it on corporate sabotage, and offer the new owner a seat on the board. He straightened his tie, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked tired, but the arrogance was creeping back into his eyes. He turned to Stone and told him to draft a settlement offer. He would offer the new owner 10% of the company in exchange for forgiving the debt. Stone looked at him skeptically, but nodded. Liam checked his phone again. Dozens of missed calls from Tiffany. He deleted them all. She was a distraction he could not afford right now. He needed to focus on the shark coming to eat his company. He did not know that the shark was already inside the building, high above the city, in the penthouse of the Pierre Hotel. I stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. The reflection staring back was not Grace the orphan. It was Genevieve, the Avenger. I wore a tailored white suit that cost more than the annual salary of the Harrington household staff. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon on my finger. I wore the royal signet ring of Valoria, a heavy gold band engraved with a lion. Sebastian stood behind me, holding a secure phone. He told me that Liam was trying to contact the director of Sterling Assets. He asked if I wanted to take the call. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. I told him to put it on speaker. The room filled with Liam's voice. He sounded desperate, breathless, trying too hard to sound confident. He asked to speak to Mr. Sterling. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding regarding the debt. He said he was eager to partner with a visionary firm like Sterling Assets. He had no idea he was speaking to the wife he had slapped 12 hours ago. I signaled Sebastian to answer. Sebastian spoke into the phone with a clipped, professional tone. He identified himself as the executive assistant to the CEO of Sterling Assets. He told Liam that there would be no negotiation over the phone. He said the CEO was currently en route to the Harrington Tower to restructure the company personally. Liam tried to interrupt, tried to use his charm, asking for just 5 minutes to explain the context of the viral video. Sebastian cut him off ruthlessly. He stated that the video was quite clear and that the moral failing of the Harrington leadership was the primary reason for the takeover. He advised Liam to have his resignation letter ready, just in case. Then, he hung up. I watched the color drain from Liam's face on the security feed from his car. He threw the phone against the window, screaming in frustration. I picked up my briefcase, a vintage Hermes made of crocodile skin. I told Sebastian it was time to go. The board meeting was starting in 20 minutes. I did not want to be late for my own coronation. The conference room at Harrington Tech was a scene of controlled panic. 12 board members sat around the long mahogany table, whispering furiously. They were old men in gray suits who cared only about their dividends. They looked at Liam with open hostility as he entered. Liam walked to the head of the table, trying to project authority. He clapped his hands, demanding order. He started his speech. claiming that the liquidity crisis was temporary, that he had a plan to secure new funding from Dubai. He lied effortlessly, his voice smooth and persuasive. For a moment, it seemed to work. The board members settled down, their greed making them want to believe him. Then, the double doors at the far end of the room opened. The room went silent. I walked in, flanked by Sebastian and two corporate lawyers from the toughest firm in New York. The sound of my heels clicking on the hardwood floor was the only noise in the room. I did not look at the board members. I looked straight at Liam. He squinted at me, confusion clouding his eyes. He recognized the walk. He recognized the silhouette. But his brain refused to accept the reality. He saw a powerful woman in a white power suit, radiating an aura of absolute command. He did not see the wife who used to fetch his slippers. I walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the seat reserved for the majority shareholder. I placed my briefcase on the table and sat down. Sebastian stood behind me, arms crossed. Liam finally spoke, his voice cracking. He asked who I was and demanded security to remove me. I looked at him calmly, my gaze boring into his soul. I told him to sit down. Mr. Harrington. I told him that security worked for me now. The board members gasped. One of them, a man who had ignored me at the company Christmas party for 3 years, whispered my name. Grace Liam staggered back, gripping the edge of the table for support. He looked like he had seen a ghost. I opened the briefcase and slid a single document down the long table. It stopped perfectly in front of Liam. It was the deed of ownership for the debt, converting 51% of Harrington Tech shares to sterling assets. I spoke clearly, ensuring every word was recorded by the stenographer. I announced that, effective immediately, I was assuming the position of chairwoman of the board. I stated that my first act was to call for a motion to remove the current CEO for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I looked around the table at the shocked faces of the board members. I asked if there was a second to the motion. Every hand in the room went up. They were sharks, and they smelled blood. They turned on Liam in an instant. Liam looked around, betrayed, his world collapsing in real time. He looked at me, his eyes wide with horror and a dawning realization. He asked, his voice a whisper, how this was possible. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my interlocked fingers. I told him that he should have read the prenup more carefully. I told him that in Valoria, we did not just get mad, we got everything. Liam tried to lunge at me, his composure finally snapping. He screamed that I was a fraud, a thief. Sebastian stepped forward, blocking his path with a wall of muscle. He did not touch Liam. He simply stood there, a silent threat. I did not flinch. I told Liam that he was making a scene, and that it was unbecoming of a former CEO. I pressed the intercom button on the table. I asked for security to escort Mr. Harrington to his office to collect his personal effects. I clarified that he had 10 minutes, and that he was not to touch any company computers. 2 large guards entered the room. They were the same guards who had watched him drag me out of the house the night before. Today, they looked at him with indifference. They took him by the arms. Liam struggled, shouting that I could not do this, that he built this company, as they dragged him out. I called out to him one last time. I told him not to forget his plant. It was the only thing in the office that he actually owned. The heavy doors closed behind him, muffling his screams. I turned back to the board members, who were now looking at me with fear and respect. I smiled. I asked, "Shall we proceed with the agenda?" Liam Harrington walked down the glass corridor of the executive floor, flanked by 2 security guards who used to salute him, but now gripped his arms like he was a common thief. The walk from the boardroom to his office felt like a funeral procession for his ego. Employees who had once scrambled to open doors for him now stood in cubicles, holding up their phones to record his disgrace. I watched the feed from my tablet in the boardroom, zooming in on his face as he realized the depth of his fall. He reached his office door and instinctively reached for his keycard, tapping it against the reader. The light flashed red. Access denied. A young IT technician, a boy Liam had probably never looked in the eye, stepped out from the office holding Liam's laptop. He told Liam that all electronic devices were company property and had been seized for the forensic audit. Liam tried to grab the laptop, shouting that he had personal files on it. The security guard tightened his grip, warning him to keep his hands to himself. Liam was shoved into the room and given a cardboard box. He stared at the empty desk, the stripped shelves, and the picture frame of him and Tiffany that someone had already placed face down in the trash bin. While Liam was collecting his stapler and his stress ball, I sat at the head of the boardroom table, turning my attention to the list of personnel files Sebastian had prepared. It was time to drain the swamp. I pressed the intercom and summoned Mrs. Gable, the executive assistant who had blocked my calls for 3 years, telling me Liam was too busy to speak to his wife. She entered the room trembling, clutching a notepad as if it were a shield. She tried to smile, a grotesque expression of fear and sycophancy. She called me Mrs. Harrington, asking if I needed coffee. I looked at her without blinking. I told her that my name was Ms. Sterling and that coffee would not be necessary. I slid a termination notice across the mahogany table. I told her that her position had been eliminated due to a restructuring of the moral code of the company. She started to cry, saying she had a mortgage, that she was just following orders. I reminded her of the day I came to the office with a fever, and she left me waiting in the lobby for 4 hours because Eleanor told her to. I told her security would escort her out. She left sobbing, passing the HR director, Mr. Burns, who was next on my list. Mr. Burns walked in with the arrogance of a man who knew where the bodies were buried. He adjusted his glasses, trying to look professional. He started to explain the severance packages for the executive team. Assuming he was still part of the inner circle, I interrupted him. I asked him if he remembered the harassment complaint I filed 2 years ago when Liam's mistress, Tiffany, insulted me at the company gala. He had shredded it. I picked up a file from my briefcase. It was a copy of that complaint, retrieved from the backup server he thought he had wiped. I told him that destroying legal documents was a federal crime. I gave him a choice. He could resign immediately with 0 benefits, or I would hand this file to the district attorney. The color drained from his face until he looked like a sheet of paper. He signed the resignation letter with a shaking hand. Within 30 minutes, the entire executive floor had been purged of anyone who had ever looked down on Grace Sterling. I stood up and walked to the window, watching a small figure exit the building below holding a cardboard box. It was Liam. He got into a taxi, not his company limousine. The king was dead. Liam arrived at the Harrington estate an hour later. The gates were surrounded by paparazzi, their flashes popping like lightning in the gray afternoon. He covered his face with his jacket, pushing through the crowd of reporters shouting questions about the fraud investigation. He stumbled into the house, slamming the heavy door against the noise. The mansion was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Eleanor was sitting in the drawing room, sipping brandy, her hands shaking so hard the glass clicked against her teeth. Tiffany was pacing the floor, smoking a cigarette, ash falling onto the Persian rug. They both looked up as Liam entered, their eyes full of desperate hope. Eleanor asked if he fixed it. She asked if he fired that ungrateful girl. Liam dropped his box on the floor. It made a pathetic sound. He loosened his tie, collapsing onto the sofa. He told them it was over. He told them Grace owned everything. Eleanor laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. She said he was joking. She said Grace was a nobody, a charity case. Liam looked at his mother with dead eyes. He told her that the charity case just bought his life for $500 million. Tiffany threw her cigarette into the fireplace, screaming that this was illegal. She said her father, the senator, would not allow this. She pulled out her phone to call him. Liam told her to stop. He said the senator had already issued a press release distancing himself from the Harrington family. Tiffany froze, the phone slipping from her fingers. She realized she had bet on the wrong horse. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Then, the doorbell rang. It was not a polite ring. It was a long, insistent buzz. The maid, who had been hiding in the kitchen, walked slowly to answer it. She returned a moment later, looking pale. She held a large yellow envelope. She said a courier just delivered it. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. Eleanor snatched the envelope, tearing it open with frantic movements. She pulled out a document stamped with the seal of the New York State Court. It was a foreclosure notice. Eleanor read the first line, her lips moving silently. Then she screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of pure horror. She threw the paper at Liam. He picked it up, reading the legal jargon. The loan he had taken from the Valoria Trust to expand the company had been secured by a personal guarantee. The collateral for that guarantee was the Harrington estate, since the loan had been called in due to the morality clause violation, and the company could not pay. The creditor had the right to seize the collateral immediately. The creditor was Sterling Assets. The creditor was Grace. Liam read the final paragraph aloud, his voice breaking. It stated that the occupants had 24 hours to vacate the premises before the locks were changed, and the sheriff was called to evict them. 24 hours. They were not just losing the company. They were losing the roof over their heads. Eleanor stood up, her face turning a terrifying shade of purple. She grabbed a porcelain vase, a Ming Dynasty antique, and threw it at the wall. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. She screamed that she would not leave. She said this house had been in the family for 4 generations. She said she would not let a gutter rat take her home. Then, she gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. She swayed on her feet, her eyes rolling back. Liam rushed to her, catching her just as she collapsed. He shouted for the maid to call 911. Tiffany backed away, looking at the scene with disgust rather than concern. She grabbed her purse, realizing that the ship was sinking fast and she needed to jump. She muttered something about having an appointment and ran out the back door, leaving her fiancé holding his unconscious mother on the floor of a house they no longer owned. I watched all of this from the comfort of my penthouse, the hidden cameras in the Harrington living room, which I had installed months ago for my own protection, now served as my entertainment. I sipped my tea, watching the paramedics rush in and load Eleanor onto a stretcher. I felt a twinge of pity, but it was fleeting. They had thrown me into the snow without a coat. I was giving them 24 hours and a warm ambulance. I was being generous. Sebastian stood beside me, watching the screen. He asked if we should delay the eviction due to the medical emergency. I shook my head. I told him that hospitals were excellent places for recovery, much better than a drafty mansion. I told him to proceed with the schedule. I wanted the locks changed at 900 hours tomorrow. I wanted my team to go in and archive every document, every piece of jewelry, every asset. Nothing leaves that house. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I knew who it was. It was Liam. The message was short, filled with typos. It said, "Please, Grace. My mother is sick. Have mercy." I looked at the word mercy. It was a funny word coming from a man who had watched his mother frame me for a crime I did not commit. I typed a reply, My fingers moving slowly and deliberately. I wrote, "Mercy is a luxury you cannot afford. Liam." I hit send. Then I blocked the number. I turned to Sebastian. I told him that tomorrow. I wanted to visit the site. I wanted to be there when they packed their bags. I wanted to make sure they didn't steal any of my silverware. The night fell over New York, covering the city in a blanket of darkness. But inside the Harrington mansion, the lights stayed on. Liam sat alone in the grand hallway, the silence deafening now that the ambulance had taken his mother away. He looked at the portraits of his ancestors on the wall. They seemed to be judging him. He had lost the company. He had lost the fortune. He had lost the house. And the woman he had discarded was the one holding the axe. He realized with a sickening jolt that he didn't even know who she was. He had lived with her for 3 years, but he had never really looked at her. He thought she was a mouse. He was wrong. She was a lioness, and she had just bitten his throat out. He put his head in his hands and wept, not for his mother, not for his marriage, but for himself. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron gates of the Harrington estate were forced open, not by a remote control, but by a team of federal marshals and private security contractors employed by Sterling Assets. I sat in the back of the lead SUV, watching the familiar driveway roll past the window. But this time, I did not feel the crushing weight of anxiety that used to suffocate me every time I returned home. The morning sun glinted off the fresh snow, blindingly bright, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn that I used to kneel on to weed by hand because Eleanor claimed the gardeners were too expensive. The convoy of 5 black vehicles came to a halt in front of the main entrance. I stepped out, my heels clicking sharply on the frozen pavement. I was wearing a black trench coat made of cashmere and leather gloves, looking every inch the executioner coming to claim a head. Sebastian walked beside me, carrying a tablet and a legal decree. The front door, the one that had been slammed in my face just 36 hours ago, was now standing slightly ajar. The lock had been broken. It seemed fitting. The house, like its owner, was already falling apart. I signaled to the movers to wait. I wanted to enter first. I wanted to see the wreckage of the dynasty that tried to bury me. I walked into the grand foyer, the air inside stale and smelling of stale alcohol and despair. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock ticking away the final seconds of the Harrington legacy. Liam was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, still wearing the same tuxedo from the party, his shirt unbuttoned, his tie loose, and a half-empty bottle of scotch resting by his foot. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, struggling to process the reality of my presence. He looked at the security team filling the hallway, then at me. He tried to stand up, stumbling slightly, grasping the banister for support. He called my name, his voice raspy and pathetic. He tried to smile, a weak, trembling attempt to summon the charm that had once fooled me. He said he knew I would come back. He said he knew I still cared. He started to walk towards me, arms open, as if he expected a hug. As if he hadn't watched his mother throw me into a blizzard. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at him with the same detached curiosity one might have for a squashed insect on a windshield. Sebastian stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Liam's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. Liam looked at Sebastian's hand, then at me, confusion clouding his face. He asked why I was doing this. He pleaded that we were husband and wife, that we could fix this. He said his mother was in the hospital, that she could die, and asked how I could be so cruel. I finally spoke, my voice echoing in the cavernous hall. I told him that cruelty was a lesson I learned from the best teacher in this very house. I pointed to the door. I told him that according to the eviction notice served yesterday, he was trespassing on private property. I gave him 5 minutes to collect his personal items, excluding any assets listed in the foreclosure inventory. Liam stared at me, the realization finally sinking in that the Grace he knew was dead. His face twisted from sorrow to anger. He shouted that I was a monster. He shouted that I had planned this all along, that I had deceived him. I laughed. A short, cold sound. I told him that deception required two people, one to lie and one to listen. And he had never listened to a word I said for 3 years. I walked past him, brushing my shoulder against his arm as if he were a piece of furniture, and headed towards the servants' quarters at the back of the house. I entered the small, cramped room where I had spent most of my time hiding from his mother's verbal abuse. It was dusty and cold. I walked to the corner of the room, near the old radiator, and knelt down. I used the heel of my boot to pry up a loose floorboard that I had deliberately kept loose for 3 years. Underneath, nestled in the insulation, was a small, plain wooden box. I pulled it out, blowing the dust off the lid. Liam had followed me, watching from the doorway, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He asked what that was. He asked if I had stolen jewelry and hidden it there. I stood up, clutching the box to my chest. I told him that this box contained the only thing of value in this entire house. Inside was not jewelry. It was the royal seal of Valoria and an encrypted hard drive containing the location of the gold reserves my father had entrusted to me before I fled the coup. It was the key to a kingdom, and it had been sleeping under the floorboards while Liam worried about his stock price. I handed the box to Sebastian for safekeeping. I turned to Liam and told him that, while he was busy looking for a trophy wife, he missed the queen living in his maid's room. We walked back to the main hallway. The movers were already tagging the furniture with barcodes. Liam watched his inheritance being catalogued for auction. He looked defeated, broken. But then, Sebastian signaled me. He had been sweeping the house for bugs and securing the assets. He pointed towards Liam's private study. He said the wall safe was open. I walked into the study, Liam trailing behind me like a ghost. The safe, hidden behind a painting of a fox hunt, was indeed open. Inside, it was mostly empty. The cash and watches gone. Likely taken by Tiffany before she fled. But there was one file left in the back, stuck between the hinges. I pulled it out. It was a thick manila folder. I opened it. The first page made my blood run cold. It was a surveillance photo of me, taken 3 years ago at the airport in Zurich, just before I boarded the flight to New York under a fake name. I flipped through the pages. There were background checks, DNA analysis results, and emails between Liam and a private intelligence firm. He knew. He had known for at least 6 months that I was not just Grace Sterling. The emails discussed Asset G and the potential leverage over the Valoria trade deals. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it felt like white heat. He hadn't just neglected me, he had been cultivating me. He was waiting for the right moment to sell me out to the rebels or use me to blackmail my father. I threw the file at his chest. The papers scattered across the floor. Liam looked down at the photos, his face pale. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The evidence was right there. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw the true villain behind the mask of the incompetent husband. He sneered. He said I was worth more as a hostage than a wife. He said he was just waiting for the coup to settle so he could name his price. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that was his fatal mistake. He treated me like an asset, an object to be traded. Instead of a person, I told him that in the game of chess, the queen is the most powerful piece, and he just lost his king. I turned to Sebastian. I ordered him to add this file to the evidence for the federal investigation. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was conspiracy to commit international kidnapping and treason. Liam lunged at me, desperate, his hands reaching for my throat. Sebastian moved faster than the eye could follow. He swept Liam's legs, slamming him onto the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud. He twisted Liam's arm behind his back, pressing his face into the dust. I looked down at my husband, writhing on the floor of his repossessed house. I told him to save his energy for prison. I signaled the marshals. They hauled him up and dragged him out the front door, his feet scraping against the expensive marble he was so proud of. I stood alone in the center of the silent house. I took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like despair anymore. It smelled like victory. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was packed to capacity with over 500 reporters from every major news network in the world. The air was thick with anticipation, and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the ozone of camera flashes. I stood backstage, watching the chaotic sea of journalists through the velvet curtain. They were there because of the press release Sebastian had sent out an hour ago, promising the biggest corporate reveal of the decade. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald green dress, a color chosen deliberately because it was the national color of Valoria. I was no longer the frightened girl who scrubbed floors in the Harrington mansion. I was Genevieve, and today I was declaring war. Sebastian nodded to me, his earpiece buzzing with security chatter. He signaled the stage manager. The lights in the room dimmed, silencing the murmur of the crowd instantly. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the podium bearing the crest of Sterling Assets. I walked out. The sound of my heels on the wooden stage echoed like gunshots. A hush fell over the room, followed immediately by the deafening roar of camera shutters clicking in unison like a swarm of mechanical locusts. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the blinding wall of light. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply waited for them to stop, commanding the room with a silence that was louder than any shout. I began to speak, my voice steady and amplified, reaching every corner of the room and millions of viewers watching the live stream. I announced that effective immediately. Harrington Tech was ceasing all operations under its current name and would be absorbed into the Royal Investment Fund of Valoria. A gasp rippled through the audience. I continued, explaining that the former CEO, Liam Harrington, had been removed not only for financial misconduct, but for crimes against international diplomacy. I looked directly into the camera, addressing the world. I stated that for 3 years, I had lived among them as Grace Sterling, a woman dismissed and abused by a family that valued money over humanity. I paused for effect. I told them that Grace Sterling was a mask. I reached up and removed the simple silver band from my finger, the cheap wedding ring Liam had bought me, and placed it on the podium. I declared that my true name was Genevieve Victoria Valoria, Crown Princess of the Grand Duchy. The room erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions, shoving microphones forward. I raised a hand, silencing them again. I said that I had returned to reclaim what was mine, and that justice would be served to those who had mistaken my silence for weakness. While I was commanding the world stage in Manhattan, a very different scene was playing out in a dingy pawnshop in the Diamond District. Tiffany Vance, the woman who had sneered at my poverty for years, was currently sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights of a shop that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. She was wearing a trench coat over her pajamas, her hair messy, trying to sell a ring. It was not just any ring. It was a vintage sapphire piece she had stolen from my jewelry box before fleeing the mansion, thinking it was just costume jewelry. The pawnbroker, a man with suspicious eyes and thick glasses, examined the stone with a loupe. He looked up at Tiffany, then back at the ring. He saw the laser inscription on the band, a serial number that marked it as royal property of Valoria, reported stolen on the International Interpol database 5 hours ago. He told Tiffany to wait a moment while he checked the current gold price. He stepped into the back room and pressed the silent alarm button under the counter. Tiffany tapped her foot nervously, checking her phone, seeing my face on every news feed. She cursed under her breath, terrified and furious. She needed cash to get out of the city before the senator, her father, found her. She didn't know that her father had already cut off her credit cards. The door to the pawn shop chimed, but it was not a customer. 2 uniformed NYPD officers walked in, their hands resting on their holsters. Tiffany spun around, her face draining of color. The pawnbroker emerged from the back, pointing a finger at her. He shouted that she was trying to fence stolen royal artifacts. Tiffany tried to run, shoving a display case aside, but there was nowhere to go in the cramped shop. An officer grabbed her arm, spinning her around and pinning her against the counter. She screamed that it was a mistake, that she was Tiffany Vance, the daughter of a senator. The officer didn't care. He recited her rights as he clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin, a sensation she had never felt in her privileged life. He told her she was under arrest for grand larceny and possession of stolen goods. As they dragged her out to the squad car, a crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Someone held up a phone, live streaming the arrest. Tiffany tried to hide her face, but it was too late. The video of the senator's daughter arrested for robbing the princess was already viral before she even reached the police station. Karma had arrived, and it had arrived with a badge. Back at the plaza, the press conference was winding down. I answered a few final questions with diplomatic grace, dismissing the Harrington family as a regrettable chapter of my past. I walked off stage to thunderous applause, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Sebastian was waiting for me in the wings, but he did not look happy. His face was grim, his jaw set tight. He handed me a secure tablet. He told me that we had intercepted a signal. A message had been sent from Liam's personal server just minutes before his arrest yesterday. It was an encrypted data packet sent to a remote server in Eastern Europe. I looked at the screen. The recipient was identified only by a code name, the General. My blood ran cold. The General was the leader of the failed coup in Valoria, a ruthless military warlord who had sworn to wipe out my entire bloodline. The message Liam had sent contained my current location, my security protocols, and the access codes to the Valoria accounts that Liam had stolen from my private journal. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. Liam had not just been greedy. He had been a traitor of the highest order. Even as his world was collapsing, he had tried to sell me out one last time to save his own skin, hoping the general would pay him for the information. A new message popped up on the screen, sent directly to my private number, which should have been impossible to find. It was from an unknown caller. The text was simple, chilling, and devoid of any emotion. It read, "The husband is useless, but his information is good. We are coming for you, Your Highness." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I forced it away. I handed the tablet back to Sebastian. I told him to increase the security detail and prepare the jet. I told him that if the general wanted a fight, he would not find a princess waiting in a tower. He would find a queen waiting with an army. I walked down the hallway towards the exit, my steps firm and resolute. The domestic drama was over. The war had just begun. And this time, I wasn't fighting for a divorce. I was fighting for my life. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi outside the Plaza Hotel created a strobe effect that made the world look like a stuttering old film reel, disorienting and chaotic. I lowered my head and stepped quickly into the armored SUV, the heavy door sealing shut with a reassuring thud that muffled the screaming crowd instantly. Sebastian slid into the seat beside me, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a vibrating tension that filled the small cabin. He tapped the partition, signaling the driver to move, and the convoy of 3 black vehicles peeled away from the curb, merging aggressively into the thick Manhattan traffic. I watched the city blur past the tinted window, the festive lights of Fifth Avenue looking like distant stars in a galaxy I was leaving behind. I checked my phone, seeing the threat from the general still glowing on the screen. "We are coming for you." It was not a bluff. It was a promise. I looked at Sebastian, noticing how his hand rested perpetually on the grip of the sidearm concealed beneath his jacket. He told me that we were taking a secondary route to Teterboro Airport to avoid potential choke points on the main highway. I nodded, trusting his judgment, but a cold knot of intuition tightened in my stomach. The general did not need a choke point. He only needed an opportunity. The convoy turned onto a narrower street in the garment district, the towering buildings casting long, dark shadows over the road. Suddenly, a massive sanitation truck pulled out from an alleyway, not slowly, but with the roar of an engine pushed to its limit. It slammed into the lead vehicle of our convoy, the sound of grinding metal and shattering glass echoing like a bomb blast in the narrow canyon of brick and mortar. Our driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest as the SUV skidded to a halt just inches from the wreckage. I was thrown forward against the seatbelt, the air knocked out of my lungs, before I could inhale. The rear window of our car exploded inward. A shower of safety glass rained down on us like diamonds. Sebastian moved faster than thought, unbuckling his belt and throwing his heavy body over mine just as a series of dull, wet thuds hit the seat where my head had been a second ago. He grunted, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain that I felt vibrate through his chest against my back. I struggled to turn, pushing against his weight, and I saw the dark stains spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his pristine suit jacket. He had taken a bullet for me. The realization hit me harder than the crash. Outside, men in tactical gear and face masks were advancing on the car, their weapons raised with professional precision. These were not street thugs hired by Liam. These were the general's elite death squad, trained to kill royalty. Sebastian slumped against the door, his breathing ragged and wet. He tried to lift his gun, but his arm was useless. I looked at his face, seeing the color drain away, leaving him as pale as the snow outside. He whispered for me to stay down. I looked at the attackers, then at the gun slipping from Sebastian's numb fingers. Fear vanished, replaced by a cold, military clarity that my father had drilled into me since I was a child. I was not Grace the victim. I was Genevieve the soldier. I grabbed the semi-automatic pistol from Sebastian's hand, the cold steel feeling heavy and familiar. I did not scream. I did not panic. I kicked the door on the side away from the shooters, tumbling out onto the asphalt and using the engine block of the SUV as cover. The winter air bit into my exposed skin, sharpening my senses. I saw the boots of 2 mercenaries moving underneath the chassis of the car. I aimed at the gap between the tires and the fender. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil traveling up my arm. 2 shots, 2 cries of pain. One attacker went down, clutching his leg. The other suppressed me with a volley of fire that sparked against the armored plating of the car. I ducked, checking the magazine. 12 rounds left. I looked back into the car. Sebastian was losing consciousness, his eyes rolling back. If I stayed here, he would bleed out. I needed to create a diversion. I spotted the fuel tank of the sanitation truck leaking onto the street, a dark rainbow pool spreading towards the attackers. It was a risk, but it was the only card I had left to play. I took a deep breath, steadying my aim. I waited for the mercenary to reload. In that split second of silence, I leaned out and fired a single round at the asphalt where the fuel had pooled. The spark ignited the vapor instantly. A wall of fire roared to life, separating me from the gunman, the heat searing my eyebrows. The mercenaries shouted, falling back from the sudden inferno. I used the chaos to scramble back into the driver's seat, shoving the unconscious driver aside. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the slick road before finding traction. I spun the heavy vehicle around, the rear bumper clipping a parked car, and floored the accelerator. We shot out of the ambush zone, leaving the wall of fire and the frustrated shouts of the assassins behind us. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other pressing a towel against Sebastian's wound. He was barely breathing. I screamed at him to stay with me, my voice cracking for the first time. He blinked slowly, looking at me with a hazy mixture of pride and fear. He whispered that I was a good shot. I wove through the traffic, running red lights, my hand leaning on the horn. I did not head for the airport. I headed for the nearest trauma center, Mount Sinai West. My diplomatic immunity allowed me to drive like a maniac, but it could not stop the bleeding. I looked at the rearview mirror. No one was following us yet. The fire had bought us time. I dialed the emergency number for the Royal Guard on the car's secure line. I gave them the code for a fallen angel situation, ordering a medical team to meet us at the emergency room entrance. I looked at Sebastian again. His eyes were closed. His chest was rising in shallow, jerky movements. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and angry. This was Liam's fault. Every drop of blood Sebastian spilled was on Liam's hands. If he hadn't sold my location, we would be in the air by now. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I promised myself that if Sebastian died, I would not just dismantle the general's army. I would burn Valoria to the ground if that was what it took to find him. We screeched to a halt in the ambulance bay of the hospital. The medical team was already there, alerted by the diplomatic channel. They pulled Sebastian out of the car, transferring him to a gurney. I jumped out, my emerald dress stained with the dark, metallic red of his blood. A nurse tried to stop me from following them into the trauma room, but I pushed past her. I told her I was his family. I stood by the door as they cut open his shirt, revealing the ugly, jagged wound near his collarbone. The monitors beeped frantically, a chaotic rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. A doctor shouted orders, calling for blood bags and a surgical team. One of the nurses looked at me, her eyes widening as she recognized my face from the news. She realized that the blood-soaked woman in the designer dress was the princess everyone was talking about. She gently guided me out of the room, telling me they needed space to work. The doors swung shut, cutting off the view of Sebastian's pale face. I stood alone in the sterile white corridor, the smell of antiseptic stinging my nose. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in blood. My loyal protector's blood. I trembled, not from cold, but from a rage so profound it felt like a physical entity living inside my chest. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with a bloody hand, smearing the screen. It was another message from the unknown number. It read, "First the pawn, next the queen." I stared at the words. They thought this would scare me. They thought this would make me run back to my palace and hide. They were wrong. They had just made the mistake of wounding the only person I trusted. I typed a reply, my fingers leaving red prints on the glass. I wrote, "You missed?" I hit send. Then I dialed the number of the director of the CIA, a contact my father had given me for emergencies only. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to hunt. The double doors of the surgical waiting room at Mount Sinai West swung open with a heavy pneumatic hiss, breaking the suffocating silence that had held me hostage for 4 hours. The chief trauma surgeon walked towards me, pulling off his surgical cap with a slow, exhausted movement that made my heart hammer against my ribs. He did not smile. He told me that Sebastian was alive, but the bullet had shattered his fourth thoracic vertebra. He said that my loyal guard, the man who had stood by my side while I scrubbed floors and endured insults, would likely never walk again. I looked down at my hands, which were still stained with the dried, rust-colored blood of the only man who had ever truly loved me without condition. I did not cry. The time for tears had passed in that ambulance. Now was the time for a reckoning. I thanked the doctor with a voice that sounded like it was coming from a deep, frozen well. I turned to the two federal agents standing guard by the exit. I told them to get the car ready. They asked if I wanted to go to the hotel to change my clothes. Gesturing nervously to my emerald dress, which was now stiff with gore, I looked at the bloodstains, mapping them like a geography of pain. I told them no. I wanted Liam to see this. I wanted him to smell the metallic scent of the consequences he had purchased. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Manhattan was a fortress of concrete and misery, a place where the sunlight went to die. The warden met me at the private entrance, his eyes widening in horror as he took in my appearance. He looked at the blood-soaked couture gown, the messy hair, and the cold, dead look in my eyes. He did not ask questions. The call from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency had clearly been persuasive. He escorted me through a maze of gray corridors, past checkpoints where guards flinched as I walked by. Sensing the radioactive aura of rage radiating from me, we arrived at the high-security visitation room. It was a sterile box with a steel table bolted to the floor. I sat down, placing a single, thin file folder on the metal surface. The door on the other side opened, and Liam Harrington was shuffled in. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with his pale, unshaven face. His wrists and ankles were shackled, the chains rattling with every step. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He looked like a man who had woken up from a dream to find himself in a nightmare. Liam sat down opposite me, his eyes immediately locking onto the dark red stains on my chest and arms. He recoiled, pressing his back against the chair, his breath catching in his throat. He asked, his voice trembling, if I was hurt. He asked whose blood that was. I did not answer. I simply stared at him, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. He started to babble, desperate to fill the void. He said he was sorry. He said the general had promised him money, $50 million, enough to save the company and buy a new life. He swore he didn't know they would try to kill me. He said he thought they just wanted to capture me and take me back to Valoria. He claimed he was a victim too, that he was manipulated. I listened to his excuses, each one a fresh insult to Sebastian's sacrifice. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I told him that ignorance was not a defense in a court of law, and it certainly was not a defense in the court of my conscience. I told him that Sebastian was paralyzed because Liam wanted to buy a yacht. Liam started to cry, ugly, heaving sobs that echoed off the concrete walls. He begged me to help him. He said the federal prosecutors were talking about charging him with conspiracy and treason. He said he was looking at 20 years in a maximum security prison. He reached out with his shackled hands, trying to touch my fingers. He pleaded for me to use my diplomatic influence to get him a lighter sentence. He said that despite everything. We were family. I pulled my hand away as if his touch were acid. I opened the file folder I had brought with me. Inside was a single document, stamped with the dual seals of the United States Department of State and the Grand Duchy of Valoria. I slid it across the table. I told him that he was right about one thing. I had used my diplomatic influence, but not to save him. Liam looked at the document, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. He stopped at the bold heading at the top: extradition order. He looked up at me, confusion clouding his tear-filled eyes. He asked what this meant. I explained it to him slowly, using the simple words one might use to explain death to a child. I told him that the crime he committed, selling state secrets and endangering the life of a royal heir, was not just a crime in America, it was a crime against the crown of Valoria. I told him that I had struck a deal with the US government in exchange for certain trade concessions regarding rare earth minerals. The Department of Justice had agreed to drop the charges in New York and grant my request for immediate extradition. Liam looked relieved for a split second. He thought he was going to a European prison, perhaps something comfortable with cable television. A cruel smile touched my lips. I shattered his delusion. I told him that he was forgetting the laws of the country he had tried to sell me to. I reminded him that Valoria was an old country with old traditions. I told him that under Article 42 of our Penal Code, high treason during a time of political instability is a capital offense. I told him that we do not have comfortable cells with libraries. We have a firing squad. Liam's face went white, a sickly, chalky color that made him look already dead. He shook his head violently, the chains rattling. He screamed that I couldn't do this. He screamed that he was an American citizen. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. It was signed by the Secretary of State. I told him that when he conspired with a foreign terrorist group to assassinate a diplomat, he forfeited his citizenship protections. I told him that the plane was waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro right now. It was the same plane that was supposed to take me home. Now, it would take him. Liam lunged at the table, screaming incoherently. The guards rushed in. Grabbing him by the shoulders, he fought them, kicking and thrashing, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a trapped animal. He shouted my name. He shouted that he loved me. He shouted that he was sorry. I stood up, smoothing the blood-stiffened fabric of my dress. I looked down at him one last time. I told him that he should save his prayers. I told him that the general, the man he tried to sell me to, would probably be sharing the same wall with him very soon. The guards dragged him towards the door, his orange jumpsuit a bright smear against the gray reality of his future, as the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his screams. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. The knot of rage that had been tightening for days finally loosened. It was not happiness. It was not joy. It was the cold, heavy satisfaction of a debt paid in full. I walked out of the prison, into the bright sunlight of the prison yard. I picked up my phone and dialed the pilot. I told him to prepare for 2 passengers, me and the prisoner. We were going home to finish the war. The wheels of the private jet slammed onto the tarmac of the Royal Air Force Base in Valoria, sending a shudder through the cabin that woke Liam Harrington from his drug-induced stupor. He looked out the window, his eyes wide with fear as he saw not a commercial terminal, but a battalion of soldiers standing in formation, their bayonets gleaming under the gray European sky. I stood up, adjusting the heavy velvet cloak that covered my shoulders, the weight of my ancestry pressing down on me. I did not look at Liam. I nodded to the royal guards who were waiting by the hatch. They moved with efficient brutality, grabbing Liam by his shackled arms and dragging him toward the door. The cold wind of my homeland rushed into the cabin, smelling of pine and old stone. It was the scent of judgment. We descended the stairs, and a roar went up from the crowd gathered beyond the security fence. It was not a cheer of celebration. It was a chant of anger. They knew what Liam had done. They knew he was the foreigner who had sold their princess to a warlord. Liam stumbled, his knees buckling as he saw the sea of angry faces. He looked back at me, pleading with his eyes for the mercy I had already told him was too expensive. I walked past him, my gaze fixed on the black armored limousine waiting to take us to the palace. The convoy wound its way up the winding mountain roads toward the ancient citadel that overlooked the capital. Liam sat opposite me in the car, shivering uncontrollably. He asked where we were going. I told him we were going to the lion's den. I pulled out my phone and sent a single encrypted message. It was the bait. I leaked the information that the prisoner, Liam Harrington, was being transported to the interrogation facility with the access codes to the National Treasury still memorized in his head. It was a lie. Liam didn't know the codes. But the general didn't know that. The general, the man who had orchestrated the coup and the attack in New York, was greedy. I knew he would try to intercept the convoy to kidnap Liam and get the money before fleeing the country. We entered the tunnel leading to the palace, the darkness swallowing the car. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the ground in front of us. The car screeched to a halt. Liam screamed, thinking this was his rescue. He shouted that his partners were here. I sat calmly, unmoving. I told him that they were not partners. They were flies, and they had just flown into the spiderweb. Gunfire erupted in the tunnel, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The general's mercenaries swarmed the vehicle, blowing the locks off the doors. They dragged Liam out, rough and violent. The general himself stepped forward, a scarred man holding a heavy rifle, a triumphant grin on his face. He grabbed Liam by the collar, demanding the codes. Liam stammered, crying that he didn't know any codes, that Grace had them. The general raised his weapon to execute Liam for his uselessness, but before he could pull the trigger, the lights in the tunnel blazed to life, blindingly bright. The walls of the tunnel slid open, revealing hundreds of royal guards who had been waiting in the service corridors. I stepped out of the car, flanked by the elite special forces. I did not hold a gun. I held the royal scepter. I looked at the general, whose face had turned from triumph to terror. I told him that in Valoria. We did not leave our trash in the tunnel. We took it out. The guards opened fire, not with bullets, but with high-voltage tasers. The general and his men convulsed and fell, twitching on the concrete. The coup was over in 30 seconds. The great hall of the palace was silent, the air thick with the dust of centuries. I sat on the obsidian throne, the cold stone seeping into my spine, grounding me. The heavy gold crown was placed on my head by the archbishop, its weight a physical reminder of the burden I now carried. Below me, at the foot of the dais, Liam Harrington knelt in chains. He was stripped of his fine suits, wearing a rough burlap tunic, looking like the peasant he truly was in spirit. Next to him, the general was bound and gagged, awaiting his public trial, but Liam's fate was mine to decide personally. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the dirt on his skin. He whispered my name. He whispered Grace. I looked down at him, my face impassive. I told him that Grace Sterling died in a snowstorm in New York. I told him he was addressing Queen Genevieve. I motioned to the guards. They stepped forward, grabbing Liam's arms. I stood up, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I pronounced his sentence. I told him that death was too easy for a man who betrayed his family for gold. I ordered the guards to take him to the oubliette. It was a cell deep beneath the palace foundations, carved into the living rock. It had no windows. It had no doors. The only entrance was a trapdoor in the ceiling. It was a place designed for people to be forgotten. Liam screamed as they dragged him away. He screamed that he was sorry. He screamed that he would do anything. His voice faded as they dragged him through the heavy oak doors, down into the darkness that would be his only companion for the rest of his natural life. I watched the doors close with a final, resonant boom. Silence returned to the hall. I walked to the balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting. casting a blood-red glow over the mountains. I thought of Sebastian, lying in a hospital bed in New York, who had paid the price for my crown. I touched the cold glass of the window. I whispered a promise to the wind. I promised that I would rule with the same ruthlessness that had saved me. I turned back to the empty room. The girl who wanted a happy marriage was gone. The queen had risen, and long may she reign.